Hi everyone, welcome to Unit 6, Furniture and Textiles. For this presentation, we're going to jump into the history of interior design. Specifically, we're going to look at furniture traditions and you'll learn about the styles, features, and motifs from history. All right, before I begin, I want to explain to you all how I'm approaching this presentation's content. Now, I understand that you are either concurrently or have previously taken our Global History of Design course sequence. So I'm really hoping that much of the historical context I present here will already be pretty familiar to you. However, to not compete with that class and to ensure that the learnings here are relevant to our furniture unit and the history of interior design specifically, what I've done, I've selected several periods in history for which I will present a brief historical context, but then demonstrate how this context is linked to, or rather is revealed through, the furnishings and materials from those periods. So, with that, to get started, again, the presentation is dedicated to furniture traditions. We will look at styles, features, and motifs from several periods throughout history. So, furniture pieces are not mere functional objects, they are storytellers of society. And what I mean here is it's really a fascinating study when we look in depth at the furnishings from a particular culture. Every part of those furnishings has a story to tell about that culture. And we don't look, of course, just to furnishings. We look to many pieces of material culture. We look to architecture, again, interiors and furniture. And textiles and decorative arts. These are all inextricably linked, and they all become fascinating storytellers. One thing to understand, one of the reasons I'm presenting this topic, is history is very relevant in today's furniture industry. If we are not armed as designers with a knowledge of history, we're at a loss for precedent. We don't understand where, if we don't understand where styles came from, we're not ready to design historically, in my opinion. And so when we study the history of interior design, specifically the history of furnishings, there's one piece within all the different furniture types that design historians typically look to track these stylistic differences, and this is the chair. So we will concentrate our study on the stylistic differences, on the evolution of the chair throughout these major historical periods. To do that, however, we have to start with the basic anatomy of a chair. Now, I'm sorry to throw all these vocabulary terms at you, but do please memorize them. Some version of this image will appear on your quiz. So, starting from the top of the chair, the top back is called the crest rail or the cresting rail. Now, we've learned the term rail before when we looked at the anatomy of a cabinet door. So it's again, that top, more horizontal member of the back of a chair. Style, that's also another word that we've learned before. These are the vertical elements that flank either side of a cabinet door. Now we see them here, again repeated in the chair, the styles. If the chair has on its back a center member, this is called the splat. The chair's splat, the back splat. Then moving down, of course, we have the seat, and then the seat rail, or more often referred to as the apron. Moving down, we have the legs of the chair and that corner unit that links, or that corner form that links the leg to the apron. If there is some kind of a decorative element to that, we refer to that as the knee. At the bottom of the leg is the foot. And then if you look at the back bottom of the chair, this particular piece, this bracing piece between the two back legs, this is called the stretcher. Now, stretchers are often throughout history ornamented. They're heavily carved. They can be gilded and painted. But at the end of the day, their purpose is for structural support. So this particular example, this particular chair, only has one stretcher. But it was very common, again, looking throughout history, that chairs, armoires, etagères, all different kinds of pieces of furniture had multiple stretchers between the multiple legs. The first culture I'd like us to learn about is ancient Egypt relative to its interiors and furnishings. I've chosen ancient Egypt for a couple reasons. One, so many aspects of the daily life of ancient Egypt translates beautifully and directly into the interiors and furnishings. And so this the interiors and furnishings as storytellers of aspects of the ancient Egyptian civilization. This is a beautiful example of how these pieces of material culture reveal society. And number two, it's actually very recognizable. So once we learn the motifs, the materials, the colors, it's really easy to see Egyptian influence in today's furnishings. So starting us off, we're going to transport ourselves back to 2500 or so BCE at the start of the Old Kingdom. Now, you probably have learned that Egyptian rule was very structured, very organized. The ruling families, which were known as dynasties, they were divided into three different kingdoms. There were a few transitionary dynasties, but the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom were the three main divisions, the main groups of dynasties. Now, the dynasties were led by the all-important Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh was basically an Egyptian king, but a very unique entity. The pharaohs were believed to be divine, and they were monarchs. They were kings that had a temporary human form. But again, they were not. They were considered different. They were gods. The ancient Egyptians also followed a system of religion called polytheism. So in addition to worshiping the pharaoh as a god in human form, they worshipped dozens of additional gods and goddesses, each that had their own realm that they ruled over. For example, here on the bottom, Ptah was the creator, Amun was the father of the gods, Ra was the sun god, Osiris was the god of the dead, and it went on and on. There was the god dedicated to the Nile, the god dedicated to agriculture and farming, etc., etc. We see another really unique aspect of the Egyptian culture when we study their city structures. Within the city or slightly outside of their main residential area, one would always find a necropolis, the plural being necropoli. Let's break this word down. Necro, meaning death, polis, meaning people. So a huge part of their society and their religious beliefs was dedicated to the worship of the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians believed that we existed more or less in our human form after we die. There's a journey we take into the afterlife, and so much about life on earth as, your tangible mortal human existence was dedicated to ensuring the preservation of what they called the Ka, or the life spirit, as it will exist in the afterlife. And again, this belief is beautifully translated into the interiors and furnishings, as we will see. Another important, highly influential aspect to ancient Egyptian culture, as seen in interiors and furnishings, is their hierarchical class system. So as an ancient Egyptian, you were born into one of about 5 divisions of social classes. It was very difficult to move between them. So basically, at birth, your life was decided for you relative to which class you belonged to. And I'm just introducing this again to reinforce how highly structured ancient Egyptian civilization, how highly organized it was. Here are the basic divisions, and there are a few subdivisions within these, but here's how I'm presenting them. First, the elite represents about 10% of the Egyptian civilization now, or the Egyptian population. So obviously, the pharaoh belonged to this, but this also was other members of the royal family, government, religious and military leaders. Then moving down, we had the upper middle class, and again, this had some subdivisions. The upper middle class represented about 30% of the population. This would include your high-ranking military officers, perhaps some of your lesser priests, and interestingly, for design, master craftsmen. So furniture makers, certain types of like muralists, these belonged to the upper middle class and enjoyed a fairly nice life. Then moving down, you had the largest section, which was the laboring class. And again, there may have been several divisions within this class, but the laboring class took up about 50% of the population. And these were the manual laborers, the artisans, the merchants. And then, sadly, about 10% of the entire population belonged to the slave class. Now, taking those cultural contexts and studying the ancient Egyptian furnishings and how what was happening in society at the time, how it's reflected in the furnishings, this is a really fascinating study. First, however, I do need to establish for you that we don't have a lot of Egyptian furniture existing today. Most of what we have has been recovered from these tomb discoveries. And for obvious reasons. The main material, we'll talk about this in a minute, the main material a lot of these furnishings was made from is wood. And obviously wood is a degradable material and never designed, never expected to last thousands and thousands of years. So most of the furnishings that we do have available and to study from are from the New Kingdom. And this is, we're looking at about 1500 to 1000 BCE. So that's an important context to establish from the start. All right. One of the biggest identifiers for ancient Egyptian furniture is its formality, its symmetry, it's highly structured, highly organized, and this is again reflective of the culture. In particular, we see the hierarchy, the hierarchical influence. Egyptian furniture is divided into one of two categories, mainly one of two categories, vernacular and high style. Now, sadly, we have very few examples of vernacular furniture. So vernacular means everyday, common furnishings. We know more about vernacular furniture when we study ancient Egyptian scrolls or murals, because occasionally they would be represented in these modes, in these pieces of material culture, but the high style furniture is typically what we have. And again, high style, this was the pharaoh's furniture. This was the royal family's furniture. So high style typically is much more elaborately decorated, made with finer woods, and again, were encased in these tombs. And so this is why they have survived. So again, we refer to common everyday furniture as vernacular, and then high style, which again was for the elite. Now, looking at specific identifying characteristics, the chair arms and the seats were most often concave, and one might think, oh wow, the ancient Egyptians were the groundbreakers in ergonomics. No, not in this case. The curved arms were somewhat comfortable, but curved chairs, the actual part where you sit, the curvature, as you'll see exaggerated in some images in future slides, was actually not terribly comfortable to sit in. The up side of the curve, where basically that would lie against the back of your thigh towards your knee, oftentimes this in fact would cut off circulation. So in fact, although it might look initially comfortable, after sitting in these pieces for a period of time, they actually became quite uncomfortable. So ergonomically, one might say this was not a top-of-mind awareness. Another characteristic of a lot of the high style of ancient Egyptian furniture is this unique characteristic. Look to the feet of the chair. They were animal feet. They were carved legs at the bottom, carved into animal feet. This style is called zoomorphic. Zoomorphic legs and feet, and we have some slides to give you better examples of this. Ancient Egyptian furniture makers used a wide variety of different motifs that they either carved into their furnishings, carved from separate materials and applied to the furnishings, painted, gilded, or essentially decorated the furniture with. And here are four of the most important. The first is the stylized lotus flower. Now, the lotus plant together with the papyrus plant, these were two types of vegetation that were very prevalent along the Nile River. So as most of the ancient Egyptian civilizations were located along the Nile River, these were very popular, again, very prevalent, very common types of vegetation that the everyday Egyptian would see daily. So the stylized lotus flower, a couple different versions here in the upper left. This flower, again, along with papyrus, was shown throughout Egypt. And we see them in tombs, in temples, on furnishings. The lotus is a symbol of the sun, of creation, and this is an interesting phenomenon of rebirth because at night, the lotus flower would close up and sink underneath the water. Then at dawn, it would resurface to the surface of the water and open again. So imagine, the ancient Egyptian watching this phenomenon. It's no wonder that this started to symbolize rebirth. And so we see this motif on a lot of the furnishings. Another very important motif, a very important religious motif to the ancient Egyptians is the scarab beetle or the sacred beetle, also called the dung beetle for a very interesting reason. The scarab beetle, one of its practices was rolling a ball of dung, or yes, we're talking about poop. It would bury itself in piles of animal poop and kind of carve out a small portion of it, roll it into a ball, which then it would roll along the ground and bury in its nest. It used it as a food source. The scarab beetle became a symbol of immortality, again, resurrection, transformation. We saw it a lot in funerary art, but the life of the scarab beetle revolved around, again, these dung balls that the beetles consumed. They laid their eggs inside them, and then when the eggs hatched, the poop would feed their young. So it got to, the ancient Egyptians observed this and started seeing this as a cycle of rebirth. So when these eggs hatched, the scarab beetle would just seem to appear from nowhere, making it a symbol of spontaneous creation, resurrection, and transformation. So once again, the scarab beetle by itself, or here in this pictorial representation with wings, this was another incredibly important religious symbol that we see throughout a wide variety of different pieces of furniture. Next, the hieroglyphics. I know you're all familiar with hieroglyphics. This was the ancient Egyptian form of writing that we have been able to decipher, considered one of the first forms of writing. And the final symbol here in the lower right is called an ankh. Now, ankh is an ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic symbol that was most commonly used in writing and Egyptian art to represent the word for life, the life force, and by extension, as a symbol of life itself. The ankh, the actual symbol itself, it looks like a cross, but the top of the cross has an oval on it, a loop, instead of the upper bar. So again, the ankh, it's a cross shape, but with an oval at the top, representing life. Of the pieces of furniture that exist from ancient Egypt that we have today, the stool was one of the most popular pieces. Being small in scale, it was easier and perhaps quicker to make than other larger scale pieces of furnishings. Here in this example, this is from the 18th dynasty, so this is from the New Kingdom. We see the zoomorphic feet, which again we'll learn a little bit more about later. We see the concave seat. And here in the stretcher design, we see the use of gold gild. Now, this is painted in gold gilded wood, which it took me a long time to try and figure out, or to try and research what type of wood. When we look at ancient Egyptian furniture and its materiality, typically it's simply described as wood, not what type of wood. So after a lot of research, after a lot of time, I did find that if pieces of furniture like this were made locally, small-scale pieces of furniture, if they were made locally, acacia wood, sycamore, poplar, willow, and elm. These were the more popular woods, again, if the piece was made locally. Now, we don't think of ancient Egypt as heavily forested, well, and certainly not today. But there were certain groves of those types of woods that, again, for smaller scale pieces of furniture, this wood was very appropriate. But keeping in mind that the high style furnishings, because they belonged to the elite class and were highly ornamented, highly decorated, again, often using gold and semi-precious stones, they were also extremely expensive. So it was not uncommon for different, stronger, more durable wood types to be imported from other regions. And so if pieces of furniture, which again, rather than the smaller scale ones, some of the larger scale pieces belonging to this high style category were often made from imported woods. And if that was the case, it was usually from cedar, fir, cypress, oak, or walnut. And here's an example of a piece of furniture that would have definitely been made from an imported wood species. So this is the throne of King Tut, the throne of King Tutankhamun. This is carved wood, and again, we're looking at cedar, fir, cypress, oak, or walnut. But here, it's highly ornamented. The carvings here are incredibly intricate. It is gilded in gold and inlaid with semi-precious stone. And this could be lapis lazuli, different garnets, very unique and rare stones. So this is a beautiful example, again, of high-style furniture. This particular piece was exclusively made, again, for the pharaoh King Tut. In this image, we see a piece of furniture that features the zoomorphic feet, so we can study it in a bit more detail here. The prevailing theory behind why legs of furnishings were carved, the feet were carved in this fashion, has to do with how the Egyptians used animals. Now, we all understand the Egyptian civilizations were well established along the Nile. The ancient Egyptians were not a nomadic people, and so they had very structured, again, organized, tried and true farming practices, and the animals became not only beasts of burden that would help with farming practices, oxen that would help manage the plows, but also the ancient Egyptians ate animals. They were raised for food production as well. So the prevailing theory believes that to honor these animals and their contributions to Egyptian society's food source, they adopted some of the more important animals' characteristics into their furnishings. Another thing I want to point out about this particular slide, this is a bed. Beds were absolute status symbols. Again, Egyptian furnishings were really only enjoyed by the upper elite class. Again, while there were some vernacular styles, that vernacular pieces in production, Egyptian was basically a floor or a ground culture. They ate on the floor, they slept on the floor, typically, considering how much of what percentage of their culture did not belong to the elite class, therefore did not have access to these furnishings. When we see certain furnishings, we understand them to be really only belonging to the elite class. And the beds in particular, being able to sleep up off the ground, became an absolute status symbol. So interestingly, this bed's feature at the end there, that raised part that today we would naturally think of as a headboard, in fact was a footboard. And the inset picture in the upper left here, does anybody want to guess what this is? This is a headrest. So essentially this is a pillow. So this would sit at the end closest to us of the bed in the main picture, and a person would rest their head or their neck against this concave central part. This image features a museum display, in fact, from the National Museum in Cairo. What we're looking at here is, again, it's another bed. At the back, again, that raised panel is the footboard, and then in the foreground, we see that concave piece. Again, this is the headrest. Also, notice the gold gilding, and look at the zoomorphic feet. Here's another example of a high-style chair. Although most of the gold gilding has worn off, this is still considered a high-style chair based on the incredible carving. So once again, identifying some of these characteristics. Looking here now at the crest rail, although it's hard to see, we have a winged scarab beetle. We have a phoenix as the back splat that is clutching two ankhs. The concave seat characteristic, the highly ornamented stretcher, and then finally at the bottom, the zoomorphic feet. Another beautiful example, high-style Egyptian chair. I would like you to study this. This may come up on your quiz. Once again, identifying the key components to Egyptian furniture. Again, on the crest rail, we have this gorgeous gilded gold winged scarab beetle. Moving down, looking at the backsplat, we have this gorgeous carved pharaoh. And this particular piece, this carved piece is called engaged. Now, an engaged backsplat means that it is carved from one piece. It's not carved from a separate piece and then either doweled or mortise and tenon in place. This is the entire backsplat, all of its intricate designs. This is carved from one solid piece of wood. Again, we refer to this as engaged. Flanking the pharaoh, as you can see, tablets with hieroglyphics on them, references to other gods and goddesses, and around the pharaoh's arm is that Ankh figure. Moving down, noticing the concave seat, again, not terribly comfortable. We see the beautifully adorned stretchers, references to vegetation along the Nile, as well as this beautiful gold gilding, and finally finishing off at the base of the chair's legs, these gorgeous painted and gilded zoomorphic feet. We have two examples of, again, stools. Now these are interesting. These fold up. Another innovation of the ancient Egyptians. So these were portable pieces of furniture. Here we see a different version of the zoomorphic design. Here in the upper left we see a tail added to where the person sits, and in both examples we see references to birds. So here the legs are heads and necks of birds. Now here's where we see the influence of ancient Egyptian furnishings in today's market. So once again, in the upper left, this is our 18th dynasty stool. Again, notice the concave chair, and the other three examples are stools that are in production today. So it's very easy to trace in these three examples the prevailing Egyptian influence. In addition to the convex seat and convex arms in seating pieces being brought into today's furnishings from ancient Egypt, another trait is being experimented with, let's say, and that is the zoomorphic legs and feet. Now, I'm not suggesting this is a fantastic piece of furniture, but I'm just now showing you when you see pieces of furniture that have this adaptation from the normal leg, now you know its source. And yet another example, very popular today, these are definitely more novelty pieces of furniture, is the stool, but the stool using zoomorphic legs. So although very different in its orientation and aesthetics than ancient Egyptian stools, we now understand where these perhaps unusual influences came from. The next civilization I'm very excited to share with you is ancient Greece. Now, the ancient Greek culture was organized very differently than the ancient Egyptian culture. The ancient Greek daily life was centered around logic and critical thinking, examining man's purpose and power while here on Earth. At each major city's center in ancient Greece, you would find the Acropolis, or the plural Acropoli. If you look at the upper left-hand picture here, this is Athens, Greece, famous Acropolis. This was the, again, city center. This represented civic life. This was an area of worship. These temples were dedicated to their gods and goddesses. Do keep in mind that the ancient Greeks also practiced polytheism. They worshiped more than one god and goddess. However, equally important was the individual man's contribution to civilization and to daily life. So breaking down this word now, Acropolis, acro, meaning life, people, is polis. So here, very different than the ancient Egyptians and their inclusion of the necropolis within their civic experience. Necropolis, again, was the city of death. Here, the Acropolis is the city of life. The Acropolis celebrated man's achievements while here on earth. And we see in the architecture and design the concept of the ideal. The concept of the ideal in art and architecture, bears on form, order, and proportion. You probably are familiar with the golden mean, this what is considered psychologically and physically perfect system of proportions that we call the golden mean. The Greeks practiced this in their art, in their architecture. One of the most famous expressions to come from ancient Greek philosophy is man is the measure of all things. You probably have heard this before. Man is the measure of all things was said by Protagoras, and it became one of his guiding philosophies. Protagoras was an ancient Greek philosopher and educator. And when he made this statement, what he was questioning, what he was talking about here is kind of the meaning of man's existence, the relativity of perception and truth, and who determines what is truth? Who determines what, in fact, is logical? And he was questioning, does this responsibility, in fact, fall to the gods, or does it fall to you and me? Do we determine what we are governed by, what we judge, how we define logic, again, which was one of the guiding forces of the Greek civilization. In any case, so while Protagoras was not using this expression specifically to describe furniture and architecture, it is an expression that can absolutely be adapted to these areas relative to proportion. So when we look at architecture and furniture from this period, we see that the proportions of the different parts of these buildings and the different pieces of these furniture, they are related to the human body. Again, man is the measure of all things, as you'll see. Buildings, as well as furnishings, are symmetrical, but we also start to see a unique phenomenon here, particularly in architecture. We see that these structures, in addition to seeking perfection, seeking this golden mean, following beauty, we also see an inclusion of existing conditions, even if they are not perfect. So many of these structures are uniquely tailored to their sites. The best example is the image that you see here in the lower left. This is the Erechtheion. The Erechtheion is one of several temples that were built on the top of the Acropolis, which again is that civic center, the city center of Athens, Greece. And so what we're looking at here is a relatively uneven portion of this hilltop, but the architectural designers came in, did not move a bunch of earth to make a perfectly flat pad on which to kind of pop this temple. No, instead, they have created different sections of this incredible, albeit somewhat deteriorated now, this incredible temple that take advantage of the different levels of the site. And so what we're looking at here, again, is this striving for beauty and perfection. We see that many areas are symmetrical, but they're all within this beautiful distribution asymmetrically within this site. So we can start to look at this concept of the ideal as also including real. So even though, again, we're achieving perfection, it does need to be based on human existence. And so we start to see this incredible balance. So the concept of ideal and real represent the Greeks. Now taking these historical contexts and concepts into the study of the ancient Greek furniture, just like the Egyptian furnishings, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of original ancient Greek furniture that survives today. So what we do, in fact, to study what the styles were, what the proportions, what the materials were, is we actually look to ancient Greek art for these clues. The picture in the upper right is a stele, which is a form of a funerary sculpture. We see a figure, a grand figure here, sitting on a Greek chair. We see a very similar image painted in the lower right. This is actually part of a larger composition that exists on a piece of Greek pottery. So these are some of the areas we look to discover, to study what their furniture actually looked like. So some of the key characteristics of ancient Greek furniture include the proportions. They were beautifully tailored to the human body. They were not overscaled. They were not these gigantic hierarchically divided pieces of furniture to establish importance. They were beautifully tailored to its occupant, to the real living human form. Now, you might ask, why do I have a picture of an ancient Greek sculpture as included on this slide? Well, I want us to study this briefly, again, to help us understand the theory, the thinking behind the furniture design. First of all, this is a very famous sculpture. This is Doryphorus. What we're looking at here, although the spear itself is missing, this statue is also called Spear Bearer. And what we're looking at is an ancient Greek Olympiad. This is a competitor in the Olympic Games, and it was a javelin thrower. Again, if you can kind of imagine a different material carved to look like the javelin that would fit between the fingers of his hand that's curled up. In any case, what we're looking at here is a life-size representation of this athlete. It was very common in ancient Greek times for sculptures to be exactly life-size. Again, they're celebrating the achievements of man here on earth, and so they're going to represent them as accurately as possible. What I want to draw your attention to here, however, and this is where it relates to the furniture, is direct your attention down to the statue's feet. And notice we have the 2 feet spread apart on its pedestal block, but we also have what looks like a tree trunk in the back. Now, to your and my uneducated eye or uninformed eye, we might look at this just as a tree trunk, as a beautiful extra embellishment. Maybe it's a bit of context that the artist is trying to include here, and that may be true. However, when we think about the material that this is carved with, this is marble. This is solid marble, which, as you know, is not a lightweight material. We're looking at hundreds and hundreds of pounds of marble that, for the most part, is vertically oriented. The weight, the balance of this marble, understanding what gravity does to it, the artists had to make sure that these statues were not going to teeter over, that this incredible amount of weight was well balanced as this large chunk of marble connected to the ground. And so, again, although we look at this as a very lifelike stance with this tree trunk as a little bit of context, what in fact we're looking at here is the artist's way of stabilizing this otherwise very top-heavy amount of weight into 3 contact points that then connect down to its base. So the weight of the marble of the head, the shoulders, the torso, the upper legs area is actually cleverly being distributed among these 3 connections to the base. Again, the 2 different feet and the tree trunk. This is very graceful, very stable, very balanced, and this technique, this approach, is applied to furniture as well. So now, when we look at the furnishings, we can better decipher what the furniture maker was thinking of. So jumping ahead to the last point here, one of the key features of most seating pieces is the leg style that you see pictured here again in the stele and in the vase painting. This beautifully graceful, curved, out-swinging leg is called a saber leg. Now this style, the saber style, is named after a saber, which is a type of sword, a curved sword. It's actually a weapon. But this form, just like what we see in the sculpture, this form of the saber leg, and keep in mind there are 4 saber legs, 2 on each side, this out-swinging leg distributes the weight of the occupant who's sitting down on it in a wider footprint. Again, just like what we see happening in the sculpture, the furniture designers are taking this same strategy, and so for someone sitting in that chair that might weigh a couple hundred pounds, this couple hundred pounds is better stabilized the wider spread the legs are. So again, this is beautifully tailored to very comfortably seat the occupant. Unless the ground is unstable, there's no chance that this occupant will fall out of the chair. So additional qualities of these chairs: there are minimal embellishments, again, except furniture that is important, like thrones and royal beds. But even on the more what we would call vernacular furniture, the furniture for everyday common man, we do see some minimal stylized motifs, and we'll learn about those. And some of these motifs include the acanthus leaf. The acanthus leaf was particularly important to the Corinthian period, which was a later period within Greek art and architecture. We saw this as a capital, a column capital embellishment. The guilloche, a guilloche design is a repeated design that is often interlaced or interlocked, similar to a braid. The most popular motif to come from the Greek period is called the Greek key, or the fret. We use Greek keys in a wide variety of pattern applications today. Dental molding, very characteristic of ancient Greek design. Dental named for teeth, essentially. So if you look carefully at this design, these notches resemble teeth. That's how it got its name. And then the final very important one is egg and dart. Study this design. You can see the egg and then the dart, and the egg and the dart. Now, I'm confident you recognize this chair style. This is the famous Klizmos chair. We use this style of chair and many variations of it quite a bit in today's contemporary furnishing. So looking at the different pieces and parts, what makes the Klizmos chair individual and unique? Looking first at that crest rail, so the part that holds our upper torso, our shoulders, it has a fairly rounded concave form. We refer to this as the horseshoe crest rail. Moving down in the center of the back, the splat, which again is that center structural member, typically in the Klizmos chair, this is unadorned. This does not have heavy carvings like what we saw with the high-style Egyptian furniture. It doesn't contain multiple materials. It's not painted. It's fairly simple. However, look at the form of it. It has a slight inward curvature. This is to accommodate the natural bend of our spine. So very different than the stiff 90-degree back of the ancient Egyptian chairs. Then, moving down onto the seat, rather than it being a solid piece, to offer the occupant a little more cushion, oftentimes the Klizmos chair, the original Klizmos chairs, were woven with reeds or straps of leather. And then finally, that characteristic saber leg. This is the main takeaway from the Klizmos chair, is this beautiful, graceful, but structurally stabilizing saber leg. Now, a slight modification of the Klizmos chair gives us the Klein. I've also heard this pronounced Kleine. Now, what we see here is an extension of the seating piece. This one also has a wrapped cushion, which, although not as common, did exist in ancient Greece. The Kleine, or Klein, is a form of a sofa. Designers also believe this is kind of the precursor to the fainting couch, which you'll learn about in a few presentations. The Klein, or Kleine, however, you could sit several occupants side by side, but it really, because of the horseshoe crest rail, it is designed for a single occupant to rest their torso back and then have their legs elevated. So it's a part laying down, part sitting up seating piece. And here are some contemporary examples, some contemporary modifications. On the left, we see a contemporary Klein, or Kleine, beautifully adapting the saber leg, the horseshoe crest rail, the woven reeds or leather straps for the actual cushion part. In the upper right, we see a stool adopting many of the same characteristics, but ancient Egyptian influence doesn't stop just with seating pieces. Here in this beautiful table, we see the use of the saber leg. Back to adaptations of the Klizmos chair. Here, these are all contemporary furnishings produced by contemporary furniture manufacturers. And so we see, sure, a mix of different materials, including the upper center. This is lucite. This is a clear plastic, one of the most popular contemporary versions of the Klizmos chair. Again, mixing different materials, mixing different proportions of the same forms, and we even see the Klizmos chair used in exterior applications, so outdoor furniture as well. And because certainly the Klizmos chair, but a wide variety of styles and motifs from ancient Greece, because these really are considered classic aesthetics and classic forms, designers today will use them in a wide variety of different applications, certainly in period, historic interiors, as well as very eclectic contemporary interiors. So again, pictured here, we see multiple Klizmos chairs. So now when you see this, in design, you'll recognize it and you know its origins. I mentioned a few slides ago the importance and prevalence of the Greek key. Looking here in the upper left at this ancient Greek vase, this is from the geometric period, which was towards the center, towards the middle of the Greek civilization. If you look towards the bottom, you can see that Greek key. Here in contemporary interior applications, you can see the prevalence of this motif. So between the bathroom, the jacuzzi tub facing in the lower left, to a pattern for carpets, sculpted carpets, legs on a coffee table, as well as trim on drapes. And the application of the Greek key goes on and on. It's simple, it's classic, it's balanced, it's geometric, it's very versatile, and again, very prevalent in today's design. Okay, let's shift gears. The next culture I'd like to introduce you to is that of Imperial China. Now, throughout the Chinese history, there have been three principal religions that have been practiced by the Chinese, again through history. The first is Taoism, and Taoism it focuses on the individual's relationship with nature. Confucianism, listed here, Confucianism is principally concerned with groups of people and ethics. And the third religion is Buddhism. This one concentrates on achieving enlightenment, attaining enlightenment through right personal management and salvation. But the religion I'm going to concentrate on here, because it really does directly influence a good percentage of interiors and furnishings, is Confucianism. So going back, Confucianism again is principally focused on groups of people and ethics. The Confucian religion teaches a respect for order and authority, so it's very controlled, peaceful relationships between fellow man, and as this translates into interiors and furnishings, we see a very controlled symmetry, a balance, precision. Again, it's highly organized. So ordered, symmetrical, and symmetry on a central axis. And Chinese design is very hierarchical as well. We have the balance as represented through the yin-yang. And again, harmony, unity, and balance govern the Chinese aesthetics. Now, a key characteristic of features within the interior environment and furniture features is where the decoration that is included is integrated into the structure. So the heavy carvings that we see on the stretchers on some of the chairs, these figurines, for example, are not carved separately and then applied onto the stretcher, either through dowels or mortise and tenon or various joinery methods. No, the stretcher is in its entirety carved from one solid piece of wood. So the individual figurines, the decoration on the stretcher is in fact the same piece of wood as the stretcher itself. So again, the decoration is integrated into the structure. Now, studying some specific pieces of Chinese imperial furniture. First of all, let me designate imperial furniture would be your very high style furniture used by the emperor. Chinese imperial furniture is from the word emperor. Again, the key characteristic is that it is very formal, very symmetrical. Now, relative to its materials, many of the furnishings are made from highly polished local hardwoods, including bamboo. A lot of the furniture is made, at least in part, if not in full, from bamboo. A key characteristic of the interiors, the furnishings will line the walls. We don't see angled pieces of furniture. We don't see furniture pulled towards, say, a center conversation area the way we do in a lot of contemporary interiors. So the furniture lines the walls, and it's oriented either parallelly or perpendicularly to the walls. Again, we don't see random angles. Everything is at 90 degrees. The place of honor, usually reserved for either the patriarch in the family or a distinguished guest, the place of honor is always furthest from the door. And this is it's more symbolic of respect, but in a sense it comes from a system of protection. So if something dangerous comes through the door, the guest of honor or the patriarch of the family is furthest away from that presenting danger. Armchairs are also reserved for seats of honor because they are more comfortable chairs to sit in. The weight of your arms is taken off your shoulders because you're placing your arms on the armrests. As previously mentioned, most of the moldings, most of the carvings are in fact carved into that piece of wood or bamboo instead of carved separately and then kind of popped on or applied on somehow. And two key characteristics, two styles that we will see in Chinese furniture. One is fretwork, and I have a slide that defines what that is. And the crest rails are often designed with a yoke crest rail design. Again, I'll show you what that means. So fretwork and yoke crest rails are very common. Some of the more common motifs that you will see in Chinese design include dragons. Now, the dragon representation usually falls into one of two categories. Either there will be just a dragon's head, sometimes carved into the end of an arm rail on a chair, sometimes in the knee of a chair leg, or oftentimes in these two examples, you'll see the dragon's head and the full body. Then bamboo. Bamboo, along with other types of vegetation indigenous to China, was often pictured in either carved or painted in their furnishings. And the final picture is an example of fretwork. Now, fretwork, the easiest way to understand fretwork is it's like a lattice. However, with Chinese fretwork, historic Chinese fretwork, typically what we're looking at is a single piece of wood that has then been hand carved into these gorgeous, usually geometric, repeated designs. Like all ancient cultures that mastered early agricultural production, they used animals to help toil the soil, to help harvest whatever the crop was. And so I know these pictures might seem a bit random, but what we're looking at here is a device that was used over oxen, over beasts of burden primarily, that again were used to help toil the fields. The piece of wood in the upper picture here, the piece of wood, the carved wood that sits on top of these animals' necks, this is called a yoke. And notice the very subtle, undulating, sweeping form of the yoke. It's also repeated down in the Chinese painting of, again, this same process. The yoke, the device, is what inspired what is commonly used as the form of a chair's crest rail. So looking at a little more detail here, the yoke pictured in the upper left, of course the animal's head fits in that lower loop area. The yoke is the form that sits on top of the neck. And then the two rings here are where ropes would be attached to help direct the animal as it's plowing through the field. And so now when we look at this, again, this subtle sweeping, upcurving form and compare it to the crest rail in the adjacent picture, we can absolutely see its influence. A slightly more stylized version in the table grouping in the picture down below. Again, this characteristic, the signature Chinese characteristic that we see in the crest rails of the chairs, again, is referred to as the yoke crest rail. And yet another example of this beautiful style in Chinese imperial chair design. Here we see the yoke crest rail, and although it's a little hard to see in this picture, that sculpture, or that carving rather, that's in the middle of the backsplat, that is in fact a dragon. So this is a very simple version, but it is still considered an imperial chair. But I did mention earlier that Chinese furniture design and interior design is very hierarchical. So this is what I'm talking about. Here's the comparison. Yeah, this is the Chinese emperor's throne with the yoke crest rail. So as you can see, much more elaborately carved and adorned. So this particular throne is one of dozens that exist in the Forbidden City, which is in Beijing in China. And returning to the second characteristic of Chinese furniture design that I'd really like to emphasize, Chinese fretwork. So expanding the definition a little bit more here, fretwork is an ancient decorative art consisting of interlacing parts which are formed either by cutting, piercing through, or sculpting the surface of a material. So here in all three types of seating pieces that we see here, we see this fretwork employed. So here we also see fretwork, but this time it's designed with bamboo. So this is pieced together bamboo rather than carved from a single piece. So again, note the characteristics of the repetition, the ordered geometry. Again, this is polished bamboo, so this is pieced together, not carved. And again, we call this open fretwork. In addition to traditional fretwork being used as parts of seating pieces being brought forward into contemporary design, the patterning of fretwork has also found homes in many other areas of interior design and furnishings, as evidenced here in these pictures. So the frame around a mirror, the pattern of upholstery on a pillow, the patterning on a decorative object, on bedding. Fretwork is a very popular decorative treatment in interior design today. So here in the beautiful case good on the left, we see a more traditional application of fretwork, but again, this is a contemporary piece. And again, I'll let you find the evidence of fretwork in the last two pictures on the right. And here is yet one more example of the use of fretwork between exterior seating elements to decorative wall screens. Fretwork is, again, I want to emphasize, very popular today. All right, it's with great enthusiasm that I take this opportunity to introduce you to the culture and design of the French monarchy. Now, this is one of my favorite periods in all of design history, in part because I have been very lucky and I've had a lot of experience with this, a lot of exposure to this, but also because I don't know many other periods in all of design history where what is going on in society at the time is so directly impacted and revealed in the interior design and the furnishing. So I'm going to completely geek out here. I apologize in advance, but hopefully you find this information equally as interesting and fascinating. So again, setting the context, there have been many Louis in the history of the French monarchy. The monarchy, by the way, is how we refer to the series of French kings. A monarchy is a kingdom, essentially. So we've had, again, many Louis that have existed throughout French history, but if someone is referring to the French monarchy, unless they specify otherwise, they're likely referring to the reign of three consecutive kings, also sometimes nicknamed just the Louis, and that's Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI, as written here. Now, just in case you have never been introduced to Roman numerals, and every now and then I do encounter this, just students, please understand that we do not pronounce these kings' titles as Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI. No, these are Roman numerals, so it would definitely behoove you to familiarize yourselves with what those are. So we say them as Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI. Anyway, During this trio of kings' reigns, which totaled 128 years, which is remarkable, between the dates of 1661 and 1789, during this trio of kingdoms, essentially, France, at the height under Louis XIV, went from glorified world power. France was the world's most powerful nation under Louis XIV. It passed through Louis XV, and sadly, by the end of Louis XVI's reign, France essentially had taken a global position that was exactly opposite that of under Louis XIV. Essentially, France was bankrupt, and at the very end of Louis XVI's reign, when sadly he lost his head by guillotine, the end of his reign finished with the French Revolution, which was when the people of France, the people of Paris in particular, overthrew the French government. But that's a topic for another day. But again, during this time, France went from this glorified world power into a bankrupt nation, and we see this evidenced in the furnishings, which again is so cool. Okay, one of the most fascinating aspects of particularly the people that were living out at Versailles and this beautiful chateau that we see, this trio of pictures here, this is Versailles. Now, Versailles, again, was the castle or the official royal residence of this trio of kings. It's just outside of Paris, but in the daily life, in the courtly life of those that lived out at Versailles, including the king and his family, there was a very rigid court etiquette that was established. And what I mean by that is there were a series of events and behaviors that not just the king and the royal family had to adhere to, but the rest of the sometimes 2,000 people that were also living out at Versailles. And this tied in directly to one of the chief concepts behind the design to come out of the French monarchy, and we refer to this concept as design as propaganda. Now, if that word propaganda is new to any of you, basically what propaganda is, items that are titled or that are deemed propagandist typically belong to a campaign that is designed to persuade or intimidate the public into thinking a particular thing about, in this case, about the king himself. This design as propaganda promoted the prestige of the king, the prominence of the king, but ultimately, for not just the people of France, but the people of the world, the king's ultimate ruling power. And again, no greater place do we see this take shape than at the Chateau of Versailles. Now, I'm going to walk you through a day in the life of the king, of the monarch. Now, all of these behaviors were set by Louis XIV and followed, for the most part, by Louis XIV. When Louis XV came into power, he didn't want any part of this. He wanted to live a much more decadent, private life. And this is where we start to see the foundations of the power of the French monarchy start to crumble. And then sadly, when Louis XVI came on the scene, the motion had already been set in place, and the power of the monarchy continued to deteriorate. Although there was an attempt to bring back this rigid court etiquette, it was really destined to fail. But anyway, topic for another day. But let me take you through a day in the life of the monarch. So, as you listen to what the day in the life of the king was like, I thought you might enjoy looking at this fabulous official royal portrait of Louis XIV. So, Louis's day would begin at 8:30 when his first valet, which was a very prestigious position to hold in court, his first valet would wake him up as part of the wake-up ceremony. Yes, it was, in French it's called the lever, which means to physically wake up. Interestingly about this wake-up ceremony, however, Louis XIV was never alone in his bedroom during this process. In fact, it was not uncommon for there to be up to 100 of his guests, the residents at Versailles, there by his bedside to literally witness him wake up. Now, if you were invited to be part of this ceremony, if you were by the bedside of the king as he woke up, this was an incredibly prestigious invitation to attain. And whether you were a resident at court, perhaps a visiting dignitary, if you were granted this invitation, what that equated to was you yourself were very powerful. And so it became almost this sense of competition between members of the royal court to receive this invitation. So again, this is all part of Louis XIV, his grand strategic design, where he used this court etiquette as propaganda to ensure faithfulness by the people of France. Anyway. So 8:30, the wake-up ceremony. This would take him to about 10 o'clock. At 10 o'clock, after getting dressed, after people watching him drink his breakfast soup, at 10 o'clock, people would gather in the infamous Hall of Mirrors to watch Louis XIV walk down the center of the Hall of Mirrors on his way to taking Mass in the Royal Chapel. Then at 11, he would have a variety of different affairs of the state that he would have to take care of, different council meetings. And so this was the time he did that, which led to probably the only time he truly was alone during the day, and that was lunchtime. He took his lunch at 1 p.m., and he occasionally would eat with family members, with the Queen, or very special invited guests, but other than that, he was typically alone. After lunch, around 2 p.m., was when the king would get his exercise, and this he chose between either walking in the gardens, hunting, or other activities, again, never alone. This took him up to about 6 p.m. At 6 p.m., he returned to more official state obligations. He would sign letters. He would talk with members of his cabinet, members of his council, study important matters of the state. This took him until 10 p.m. They had dinners much later in France at this time. So dinner was always at 10 p.m., which was typically taken at the royal table in the royal dining hall. And again, it was a very, very ceremonious, a lot of pomp and circumstance around watching the king eat. And then this led to the opposite of the wake-up ceremony, the going-to-bed ceremony. And in French, this is the coucher. And once again, if you received an invitation to witness the king fall asleep, it was a very prestigious thing. The next morning, he'd get up and do the same thing again, over and over, day by day. Again, it was not necessarily enjoyable for the king, but it was all designed to instill loyalty because, again, invitations to witnessing these events became a real hot commodity. All right, now that you understand a little of the historic context and, again, this day in the life of the king, let's see how these interesting aspects of French monarchical society, how do these translate into the interiors and furniture? Now, most of these images are from Versailles or other French chateaus from this period. So, first, every square inch of every surface in these interiors was designed and created to instill awe, again, as part of this propagandist campaign to promote the power of the king. Everything was very heavily ornamented with exquisite materials. This is also the period where we see the emergence of suites. Again, these are groups of furnishings that were designed to be placed in a very specific room together. And the materials that we associate with French monarchical design include gold, gold gilding, solid gold objects, as well as gold-threaded textiles, heavy tapestries, lots of tassels and trims and borders to the textiles, feathers, marbles, a wide variety of different marbles from all over the world. And as we will see in the next slide, there were many very signature French monarchical motifs as well. Incidentally, the picture here in the upper right is the king's bedchamber. So from the day in the life of the king, you might remember that there were potentially up to 100 people at a time that would sit and watch the king wake up and watch the king go to bed. Inevitably, I'm asked if this little balustrade that you see in front of his bed is this original? And in fact, yes, it is. This was the demarcation line, basically the barrier that protected the king from these witnesses to, again, the lever, which was the wake-up ceremony, and the coucher, the evening, the going to bed ceremony. And a few of the French motifs used during the monarchical period. The first one was associated with Louis XIV. This is the Apollo mask, otherwise known as the sun god. And Apollo was the ancient Roman god of the sun, of war, and Louis XIV in particular loved all things Roman and thought of himself, in fact, as his power equal to that of a Roman emperor. So it's by no surprise that we see this adaptation of the Apollo mask itself. So again, this is a symbol that represents Louis XIV. Now, the fleur-de-lis in the upper middle picture, this is a stylized lily flower. Now, members of both the French monarchy and the Italian monarchy would, as you know, one reign changed to the next, they would adopt different stylized versions of the fleur-de-lis. So this, in fact, was not an uncommon motif among several countries' monarchies. But nonetheless, we see this all over the French monarchical design, the fleur-de-lis, the lily flower. Now, a motif that is associated mostly with Louis XV and later Louis XVI is what we see here, singerie. Now, a singe, S-I-N-G-E, is the French word for monkey. Now, we see this monkey motif, the singerie, repeated on wall panels, on servingware, and it kind of had a twofold meaning. One, as you might know, monkeys are very curious creatures, and there was a curiosity and potentially a slightly mischievous association made with this emblem, this motif. Also, it was a symbol of the exotic. Monkeys are not naturally indigenous to France, although they were imported as kind of playthings of various European courts. They were popular in zoos at the time, so it also hinted to exoticism and travel. Next, the shell or rocaille motif. This is what we see at the bottom, in the bottom section of this drawer handle. Rocaille is the French word for shell. And so this beautiful, sweeping, undulating, curved motif we see particularly during Louis XV's era. And then finally, belonging to all of the three French monarchs, cherubs. Again, particularly popular in Louis XV's era, but these chubby little babies we see carved, we see painted, we see gilded, we see part of furnishings on walls, on ceiling murals. So these wonderful chubby little cherubs we see everywhere. Now, the chair style from the French monarchical period that I would like you to memorize is pictured here. This is a fauteuil. Fauteuil, say that, fauteuil. And it is the French word for, again, this piece of furniture pictured here. It's an open arm armchair. And this particular one is the larger example on the right. This is from the Louis XV period. And now you've heard me a couple times differentiate between Louis XIV, Louis XV, and XVI stylistically. As a general French monarchical category, you will see a lot of similarities between the kings' styles. Again, all three kings were consecutive and they ruled together for 128 years. And so it's, again, by no surprise that aesthetically there are many commonalities between the design from their respective reigns. Now, in a couple slides, we will dig down a little deeper and we'll learn a few of the differences. But for now, we can use this fauteuil as representing French monarchical chair design. So looking at the specifics, if we look at the crest rail, the back part of the chair, we see centered this beautiful rocaille decoration, or again, this shell decoration. It was very common in the fauteuils from this period for there to be heavy tapestries, beautiful velvets, embroidered textiles used on the back of the back cushion and the seat cushion. Here in this example, we see a beautiful custom-made tapestry with a pastoral scene or a scene out in the country. Another characteristic of this chair is the beautiful curved arms that are open. Again, the carvings are there's space between the armrest and the seat cushion. And notice on the top of the armrest we have this beautifully tailored, custom designed cushion. And moving down to the bottom part of the chair, this beautiful curved leg has its own style, name, called cabriole leg, and that is where the knee of the leg protrudes out. There's often a carved decoration on it, but then as this sweeping S-shaped curve comes back in towards the bottom, the angle reverses. So again, it's very much an S shape. Okay, as promised, we're going to dig a little bit deeper now into the stylistic differences between the three monarchs, Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI. So these three examples pictured here, these are all considered French monarchical fauteuils, again, this specific style of chair. But as you can see here, there are many stylistic differences, each again associated with the single monarch. And so now we're going to dig into what was happening at the time during each king's reign and how, again, this so beautifully directly translates into these specific furnishings. So, again, here are the three fauteuils. And here are our three rulers. So, again, the formal royal portrait, Louis XIV. Next is Louis XV, and finally this poor guy, Louis XVI. So let's learn a little bit about each. And again, please understand, I'm just skimming the surface. There's so much more to learn that, again, I will totally hopefully have a chance to geek out on you later on and share more details with you. But for now, again, just drop in the bucket. But I think you'll find this pretty interesting. So first we have Louis XIV. He's associated with the Baroque period, and so his date 1661 to 1715. It's under Louis XIV that France becomes a global power. Again, the most powerful nation in the world. This is when France is doing a lot of its expansion, global exploration, and expansion of its colonies. Now, Louis XIV is known, his type of kingship is known as what's called an absolute monarchy. And what that means is the king was by no means just simply a figurehead. Every decision that was made with state control had to be run by him. Louis XIV was the supreme controller of all aspects of society. When we look at the interior design and the furnishings from his period, he uses very much this classical vocabulary and opulent ornamentation. Everything about his furnishings, his interiors, his decorative arts, his textiles was designed to establish his power, order. It's very formal. Now here is the fauteuil associated with Louis XIV. Again, very heavily adorned, overscaled, very opulent, formal, lush textiles, lots of fringe. Of course, as you can see, lots and lots of gold too. Again, this was designed to showcase the king and to establish his power. Now, moving into Louis XV. Louis XV had an interesting story. So Louis XV is associated with the Rococo period. Louis XV didn't want much to do at all with this rigid court etiquette. He wanted to enjoy all the pleasures of being a king, but didn't want many of the responsibilities of being the king. So he actually he didn't like life out at Versailles. He preferred to leave Versailles for the pleasures of Paris. Look, Louis XV wanted to play. He wanted to lead a very decadent, escapist lifestyle. He was very much preoccupied with the frivolities of life. Much of his design is with respect to, again, textiles, interiors, decorative arts, was very soft and playful, again, very delicate, reflecting this escapist, kind of fluffy lifestyle that he wanted to lead. So here is his fauteuil. curvy, light, playful, frivolous. The textile pattern itself, again, is very fluffy, lots of pastel colors, many pastoral scenes or scenes that lightly reference things like beauty and art and love. And here we have this graceful cabriole leg. So again, we have this frivolous lifestyle, and now we have this very playful, feminine, fluffy chair. And that brings us to this sad guy. This is Louis XVI. Now, when Louis XVI came to power, France was in trouble. Louis XV had so vastly and ridiculously abused his position as ultimately the protector of the people of France. He used their very hard-earned tax dollars to pay for lavish parties, to pay for hundreds of pairs of shoes and new outfits and trips to the countryside, and just this, again, this very decadent lifestyle that he wanted to maintain, during which he basically forgot or didn't or ceased caring about the people of France, which of course were those that were able to provide this luxurious lifestyle. So again, when Louis XVI came into power, the French people were very well aware of the abuses committed by Louis XV, and there was a series of pretty serious upper middle class uprisings against the aristocracy. And so this is very interesting. Louis XVI led a very conscious campaign to try and basically quell these uprisings through with the help of design, and retreat and show his people that he could exercise restraint, that he had a good control over the money, that he was dedicated to restoring the faith of the French people in the monarchy. Interestingly, though, Louis XVI wasn't much good at ruling. He wasn't much more interested in ruling France than his predecessor, Louis XV. But so the aristocracy still seeks pleasure, but it disguises it in this serious, simple classicism. So again, the goal of Louis XVI was to kind of fly under the radar, keep a low profile, but work very hard at establishing the loyalty of the French people again. And this was a fauteuil from his period. Notice the diminished scale. This is very, very controlled, very ordered. We're not looking at these big, ostentatious, signs of power. Again, it's very restrained. We see a return to much straighter lines, much more predictable, logical lines. The textiles themselves, we're not looking at heavy embroidered pieces, gold-threaded tapestries. We're looking at refined patterns as well. Very calm, very serene, very respectful, very serious. Again, in the hopes of regaining the favor of the French people. So again, I think that's pretty cool. I think it's cool when you really have the opportunity to dive into the true histories of interiors and furnishings, how closely associated their styles are with, in this case, these monarchs and what was happening in society at the time. One final thing I wanted to share with you, a very popular textile pattern that came from this French monarchical period. This is called toile de Jouy. Toile de Jouy, this particular pattern, is one of the oldest patterns of toile. Toile is a linen cloth, and it's called toile de Jouy because it's from the town of Jouy in France. Different towns printed different patterns on their textiles. This was originally all done with stencils by hand, and it has since, of course, now in today's textile manufacturing, this is printed with the help of computers. But nonetheless, what characterizes toile de Jouy in particular, are these beautiful pastoral scenes. Typically, the field color is a cream, sometimes a light yellow, sometimes white, and then the actual pattern itself is printed often with blue, beige, sometimes yellow, but the most popular color is what we see here, this kind of deep red. Here we have a contemporary bedroom that has both a nod to toile patterns, as well as, look at this, a Louis XV fauteuil. The picture on the left here features two versions of French monarchical chairs. Although these technically are not fauteuils, these are called bergères. You'll learn this in a future slide. This is very Louis XVI influenced. Again, note the very straight legs. And then the remaining two pictures on the right are also contemporary examples of fauteuils. In fact, the lower one on the right is a very famous contemporary chair by one of the most internationally well-known interior designers, Philippe Starck. Philippe Starck created this chair is called the Ghost chair, absolutely with inspiration from the French fauteuil.